welcome to this stock analysis investment brief. Today what I wanted to do is to look at the investment outlook in the light of raw materials supply constraints and also the interplay with global population, the rising global population. So the first thing I wanted to look at is peak oil, and what I'll do is I'll show you a chart which shows annual production of oil and annual estimates of annual discovery of oil over the last 50 or 60 years. And what you see is that discovery of oil peaked in the 1960s and has fallen away, and currently discovery of oil has been around about 5 or 6 billion barrels annually, but annually we're now consuming about 27 billion barrels of oil. So clearly we're emptying the global tank of oil. And if we step back and look at over a longer period of time, we can see how oil production has risen from nothing, basically 110 years ago, to a peak around about the current time. Discovery seemed to peak in the early 60s and has fallen away, and now 40 years later, 50 years later, we're in a position where globally we're expecting oil production to peak around about now, 2012 to 2014. But alarmingly, if you look out to only 18 years' time, to 2030, it looks like production in 2030 will be about the same as production that we saw in 1975. But clearly, as they say, oils ain't oils, and crude oil is a very dense energy source. And we're also, the numbers that you see in the press include oil, condensate, biofuels, the oil that's produced from tar sands, all sorts of liquids. And a lot of those liquids have a lower energy content. Condensate, for instance, natural gas liquids have a much lower energy content than crude oil. So if you adjust for the energy content of those liquids, you can see that really over the last 10 years, certainly the last 8 years, there's been a plateau of actual energy content of all liquids produced. It seemed to reach a plateau in about 2004 and has been only slightly rising, if flat, over the last 8 years or so. And that has implications for the way we invest our money, and it also has implications for industry globally. So now I want to jump to population growth. And the chart I'm showing now shows the population rise since the 15th century. And really it reached a billion just after 1800, about 1810, and began to rise very sharply through the Industrial Revolution. When I was born in 1952, the population of the planet was about 2.6, 2.7 billion, and it's just recently touched 7 billion. And now we're seeing the population growing at about 1 billion people every 15 years. So if we look at the interplay between energy production and consumption and the number of people on the planet, what you see is a fairly alarming trend. The amount of liquid petroleum products produced per person in the world peaked in the late 1970s, plateaued, and certainly in the last 8 or 10 years has begun to fall dramatically. Because of that plateau in production, whilst population continues to rise at 80 million a year, the amount of usable energy per person in the planet has been falling away quite dramatically. And that has obvious implications for the lifestyle and for our future as a species, really. So digging down further into this population issue, we look at the amount of arable land on the planet. And certainly, whilst the population of the planet has increased 7-fold in the last 200 years, that's just 3 lifespans, the amount of arable land has actually not gone up. We've still only got one planet, and the amount of arable land today is the same as it was 200 years ago, except the amount of arable land per person keeps falling. Firstly, the population is rising, and secondly, people are living on more and more of that arable land. So the amount of available arable land per person is falling dramatically, and this is shown by this slide. Also, what we've seen is a big expansion in crop yields. In the 40s, 50s and 60s, crop yields grew at 2 to 3% per annum, but that yield expansion has fallen away, and so now we're lucky to be getting 1% yield expansion every year. Similarly, population growth has fallen. So population was growing at 2.5% in 1960, but the population of the planet in 1960 was only about 3 billion people. So we were getting about another 50 million new people onto the planet then. And thankfully the population growth rate has fallen to about 1.1% currently, which sees an additional 80 million per annum. So even though the growth rate has halved, the number of new people on the planet is 30 million more each year now than it was 40, 50 years ago. So looking at all this data, where does this leave us and what should we be thinking about when we want to invest? Clearly, what's required is for global population to stabilise rapidly. We need to be able to stabilise our population and then probably see the population reduced to a stable and sustainable level. What that level is, it depends who you ask, but certainly at 7 billion, it's not sustainable. So a stabilisation of population would leave people in a much more resilient position in the face of supply constraints for raw materials. Also, it would leave us in a much more prosperous position than would otherwise be the case. Our children and our grandchildren would be in a much more resilient and prosperous situation than if the population continues to grow. So I can hear you asking, how do we achieve that? Well, it's pretty simple. I mean, if you look around the world at countries where women are empowered, where they have education, where they have access to family planning, they choose to have families on average less than 2. If you go to Kerala, which has a high women's literacy, you'll see 1.7 children per woman. If you go to Thailand, where there's been a well-orchestrated program of educating the population about family planning, fertility rates are 1.9. In Europe, many countries have stabilised their population. In Japan, the population is slowly declining, about 70 or 80,000 a year. I mean, and looking at Japan, I mean, they have no basic raw materials. They rely on imports for all of their energy, so they really need to look closely at what would be a sustainable population on those islands in Japan. So it is really an easy prospect to achieve a stable population by educating and empowering women and educating the broader community about what the alternative is if population continues to grow. People will make that logical choice once they know the facts. At the moment, people don't really know the facts. And so also, how should we be restructuring our portfolios? How should we be investing, taking a 10, 20, 30-year view, looking to the future? Well, clearly, investing in fossil fuels, which are becoming more and more scarce, is going to be a sound proposition because the prices of these fossil fuels will continue to rise in real terms. Even though burning of these fossil fuels may well do damage to the environment, it makes sense from an investment point of view to be there. Another area to invest is in prime agricultural land. Clearly, food will be at a premium as we move forward. Prices for food have been rising over the last 5 or 10 years, and the price of agricultural land will also rise over the next 5 or 10 years. So you need to be there, you need to secure your future with an investment in prime agricultural land. The other areas for investment would be proven renewable technologies, proven energy storage technologies, and proven energy saving and energy reduction technologies. So the areas of primary energy, fossil fuels, renewable energy, wind, photovoltaic, energy storage, new technologies in the energy area, and arable land. Those are the areas that StockAnalysis is looking at, and those are the areas where StockAnalysis will be looking for investment opportunities for subscribers.